The Enchantress of Sylaire by Clark Ashton Smith. "Why, you big ninny? I could never marry you," declared the demoiselle Dorothée, only daughter of the Sieur de Flèche. Her lips pouted at Anselme like two ripe berries. Her voice was honey, but honey filled with bee stings. "You are not so ill-looking, and your manners are fair, but I wish I had a mirror that could show you to yourself for the fool that you really are." "Why?" queried Anselme, hurt and puzzled. "Because you are just an addle-headed dreamer, poring over books like a monk. You care for nothing but silly old romances and legends. People say that you even write verses. It is lucky that you are at least the second son of the Comte du Framboisier, for you will never be anything more than that." "But you loved me a little yesterday," said Anselme bitterly. "A woman finds nothing good in the man she has ceased to love." "Dolt! Donkey!" cried Dorothée, tossing her blonde ringlets in pettish arrogance. "If you were not all that I have said, you would never remind me of yesterday. Go, idiot, and do not return." Anselme the hermit had slept little, tossing distractedly on his hard, narrow pallet. His blood, it seemed, had been fevered by the sultriness of the summer night. Then, too, the natural heat of youth had contributed to his unease. He had not wanted to think of women, a certain woman in particular. But, after 13 months of solitude, in the heart of the wild woodland of Averoigne, he was still far from forgetting. Crueler even than her taunts was the remembered beauty of Dorothée de Flèche, the full ripened mouth, the round arms and slender waist, the breast and hips that had not yet acquired their amplest curves. Dreams had thronged the few short intervals of slumber, bringing other visitants, fair but nameless, about his couch. He rose at sundown, weary but restless. Perhaps he would find refreshment by bathing, as he had often done, in a pool fed from the river Isoile and hidden among alder and willow thickets. The water, deliciously cool at that hour, would assuage his feverishness. His eyes burned and smarted in the morning's gold glare when he emerged from the hut of wattled osier withes. His thoughts wandered, still full of the night's disorder. Had he been wise, after all, to quit the world, to leave his friends and family, and seclude himself because of a girl's unkindness? He could not deceive himself into thinking that he had become a hermit through any aspiration towards sainthood, such as had sustained the old anchorites. By dwelling so much, alone, was he not merely aggravating the malady he had sought to cure? Perhaps, it occurred to him belatedly, he was proving himself the ineffectual dreamer, the idle fool that Dorothy had accused him of being. It was weakness to let himself be soured by a disappointment. Walking with downcast eyes, he came unaware to the thickets that fringed the pool. He parted the young willows without lifting his gaze, and was about to cast off his garments. But at that instant, the nearby sound of splashing water startled him from his abstraction. With some dismay, Anselme realized that the pool was already occupied. To his further consternation, the occupant was a woman. Standing near to the center where the pool deepened, she stirred the water with her hands till it rose and rippled against the base of her bosom. Her pale, wet skin glistened like white rose petals dipped in dew. Anselme's dismay turned to curiosity, and then to unwilling delight. He told himself that he wanted to withdraw, but feared to frighten the bather by a sudden movement. Stooping with her clear profile and her shapely left shoulder toward him, she had not perceived his presence. A woman, young and beautiful, was the last sight he had wished to see. Nevertheless, he could not turn his eyes away. The woman was a stranger to him, and he felt that she was no girl of the village or countryside. She was lovely as any châtelaine of the great castles of Averoigne, and yet surely no lady or demoiselle would bathe unattended in a forest pool. Thick curling chestnut hair, bound by a light silver fillet, billowed over her shoulders and burned to red, living gold where the sun rays searched it out through the foliage. Hung about her neck, a light golden chain seemed to reflect the lusters of her hair, dancing between her breasts as she played with the ripples. The hermit stood watching her like a man caught in webs of sudden sorcery. His youth mounted within him in response to her beauty's evocation. Seeming to tire of her play, she turned her back and began to move toward the opposite shore, where, as Anselme now noticed, a pile of feminine garments lay in charming disorder on the grass. Step by step, she rose from the shoaling water, revealing hips and thighs like those of an antique Venus. Then beyond her, he saw that a huge wolf, appearing furtively as a shadow from the thicket, had stationed itself beside the heap of clothing. Anselme had never seen such a wolf before. He remembered the tales of werewolves that were believed to infest that ancient wood, and his alarm was touched instantly with the fear which only preternatural things can arouse. The beast was strangely colored, its fur being a glossy bluish-black. It was far larger than the common gray wolves of the forest. Crouching inscrutably, half hidden in the sedges, it seemed to await the woman as she waded shoreward. Another moment, thought Anselme, and she would perceive her danger, would scream and turn in terror. But still she went on, her head bent forward as if in serene meditation. "Beware the wolf!" he shouted, his voice strangely loud and seeming to break a magic stillness. Even as the words left his lips, the wolf trotted away and disappeared behind the thickets toward the great elder forest of oaks and beeches. The woman smiled over her shoulder at Anselme, turning a short oval face with slightly slanted eyes and lips red as pomegranate flowers. Apparently she was neither frightened by the wolf nor embarrassed by Anselme's presence. "There is nothing to fear," she said in a voice like the pouring of warm honey. "One wolf or two will hardly attack me." "But perhaps there are others lurking about," persisted Anselme. "And there are worse dangers than wolves for one who wanders alone and unattended through the forest of Averoigne. When you have dressed, with your permission, I shall attend you safely to your home, whether it be near or far." "My home lies near enough in one sense, and far enough in another," returned the lady cryptically. "But you may accompany me there if you wish." She turned to the pile of garments, and Anselme went a few paces away among the alders and busied himself by cutting a stout cudgel for weapon against wild beasts or other adversaries. A strange but delightful agitation possessed him, and he nearly nicked his fingers several times with the knife. The misogyny that had driven him to a woodland hermitage began to appear slightly immature, even juvenile. He had let himself be wounded too deeply and too long by the injustice of a pert child. By the time Anselme finished cutting his cudgel, the lady had completed her toilet. She came to meet him, swaying like a lamia. A bodice of vernal green velvet, bearing the upper slopes of her breasts, clung tightly about her as a lover's embrace. A purple velvet gown, flowered with pale azure and crimson, molded itself to the sinuous outlines of her hips and legs. Her slender feet were enclosed in fine soft leather buskins, scarlet dyed, with tips curling pertly upward. The fashion of her garments, though oddly antique, confirmed Anselme in his belief that she was a person of no common rank. Her raiment revealed, rather than concealed, the attributes of her femininity. Her manner yielded, but it also withheld. Anselme bowed before her with a courtly grace that belied his rough country garb. "Ah! I can see that you have not always been a hermit," she said, with soft mockery in her voice. "You know me then," said Anselme. "I know many things. I am Sephora, the Enchantress. It is unlikely that you have heard of me, for I dwell apart in a place that none can find, unless I permit them to find it." "I know little of enchantment," admitted Anselme, "but I can believe that you are an enchantress." For some minutes they had followed a little used path that serpentined through the antique wood. It was a path the hermit had never come upon before in all his wanderings. Lithe saplings and low-grown boughs of huge beeches pressed closely upon it. Anselme, holding them aside for his companion, came often in thrilling contact with her shoulder and arm. Often she swayed against him, as if losing her balance on the rough ground. Her weight was a delightful burden, too soon relinquished. His pulses coursed tumultuously and would not quiet themselves again. Anselme had quite forgotten his eremitic resolves. His blood and his curiosity were excited more and more. He ventured various gallantries, to which Sephora gave provocative replies. His questions, however, she answered with elusive vagueness. He could learn nothing, could decide nothing about her. Even her age puzzled him. At one moment he thought her a young girl, the next a mature woman. Several times, as they went on, he caught glimpses of black fur beneath the low shadow foliage. He felt sure that the strange black wolf he had seen by the pool was accompanying them with a furtive surveillance. But somehow his sense of alarm was dulled by the enchantment that had fallen upon him. Now the path steepened, climbing a densely wooded hill. The trees thinned to straggly, stunted pines, encircling a brown, open moorland as the tonsure encircles a monk's crown. The moor was studded with druidic monoliths, dating from ages prior to the Roman occupation of Averoigne. Almost at its center, there towered a massive cromlech, consisting of two upright slabs that supported a third like the lintel of a door. The path ran straight to the cromlech. "This is the portal of my domain," said Sephora as they neared it. "I grow faint with fatigue. You must take me in your arms and carry me through the ancient doorway." Anselme obeyed very willingly. Her cheeks paled, her eyelids fluttered and fell as he lifted her. For a moment he thought that she had fainted, but her arms crept warm and clinging around his neck. Dizzy with the sudden vehemence of his emotion, he carried her through the cromlech. As he went, his lips wandered across her eyelids and passed deliriously to the soft red flame of her lips and the rose pallor of her throat. Once more she seemed to faint, beneath his fervor. His limbs melted, and a fiery blindness filled his eyes. The earth seemed to yield beneath them like an elastic couch, as he and Sephora sank down. Lifting his head, Anselme looked about him with swiftly growing bewilderment. He had carried Sephora only a few paces, and yet the grass on which they lay was not the sparse and sun-dried grass of the moor, but was deep, verdant, and filled with tiny vernal blossoms. Oaks and beeches, huger even than those of the familiar forest, loomed umbrageously on every hand, with masses of new golden-green leafage, where he had thought to see the open upland. Looking back, he saw that the gray, lichened slabs of the cromlech itself alone rearmed of that former landscape. Even the sun had changed its position. It had hung at Anselme's left, still fairly low in the east, when he and Sephora had reached the moorland. But now, shining with amber rays through a rift in the forest, it had almost touched the horizon on his right. He recalled that Sephora had told him she was an enchantress. Here, indeed, was proof of sorcery. He eyed her with curious doubts and misgivings. "Be not alarmed," said Sephora, with a honeyed smile of reassurance. "I told you that the cromlech was the doorway to my domain. We are now in a land lying outside of time and space, as you have hitherto known them. The very seasons are different here. But there is no sorcery involved, except that of the great ancient druids, who knew the secret of this hidden realm and reared those mighty slabs for a portal between the worlds. If you should weary of me, you can pass back at any time through the doorway, but I hope that you have not tired of me so soon." Anselme, though still bewildered, was relieved by this information. He proceeded to prove that the hope expressed by Sephora was well-founded. Indeed, he proved it so lengthily and in such detail that the sun had fallen below the horizon before Sephora could draw a full breath and speak again. "The air grows chill," she said, pressing against him and shivering lightly. "But my home is close at hand." They came in the twilight to a high round tower among trees and grass-grown mounds. "Ages ago," announced Sephora, "there was a great castle here. Now the tower alone remains, and I am its chatelaine, the last of my family. The tower and the lands about it are named Sylaire." Tall dim tapers lit the interior, which was hung with rich erases, vaguely and strangely pictured. Aged, corpse-pale servants in antique garb went to and fro with the furtiveness of specters, setting wines and foods before the enchantress and her guest in a broad hall. The wines were of rare flavor and immense age, the foods were curiously spiced. Anselme ate and drank copiously. It was like some fantastic dream, and he accepted his surroundings as a dreamer does, untroubled by their strangeness. The wines were potent, drugging his senses into warm oblivion. Even stronger was the inebriation of Sephora's nearness. However, Anselme was a little startled when the huge black wolf he had seen that morning entered the hall and fawned like a dog at the feet of his hostess. "You see, he is quite tame," she said, tossing the wolf bits of meat from her plate. "Often I let him come and go in the tower, and sometimes he attends me when I go forth from Sylaire." "He is a fierce-looking beast," Anselme observed doubtfully. It seemed that the wolf understood the words, for he bared his teeth at Anselme with a hoarse, preternaturally deep growl. Spots of red fire glowed in his somber eyes, like coals fanned by devils in dark pits. "Go away, Malachy," commanded the enchantress sharply. The wolf obeyed her, slinking from the hall with a malign backward glance at Anselme. "He does not like you," said Sephora. "That, however, is perhaps not surprising." Anselme, bemused with wine and love, forgot to inquire the meaning of her last words. Morning came too soon, with upward slanting beams that fired the treetops around the tower. "You must leave me for a while," said Sephora after they had breakfasted. "I have neglected my magic of late, and there are matters into which I should inquire." Bending prettily, she kissed the palms of his hands. Then, with backward glances and smiles, she retired to a room at the tower's top beside her bedchamber. Here, she had told Anselme, her grimoires and potions and other appurtenances of magic were kept. During her absence, Anselme decided to go out and explore the woodland about the tower. Mindful of the black wolf, whose tameness he did not trust despite Sephora's reassurances, he took with him the cudgel he had cut that previous day in the thickets near the ice oil. There were paths everywhere, all leading to fresh loveliness. Truly, Sylaire was a region of enchantment. Drawn by the dreamy golden light and the breeze laden with the freshness of spring flowers, Anselme wandered on from glade to glade. He came to a grassy hollow, where a tiny spring bubbled from beneath mossed boulders. He seated himself on one of the boulders, musing on the strange happiness that had entered his life so unexpectedly. It was like one of the old romances, the tales of glamour and fantasy that he had loved to read. Smiling, he remembered the gibes with which Dorothée de Flèche had expressed her disapproval of his taste for such reading matter. What, he wondered, would Dorothée think now? At any rate, she would hardly care. His reflections were interrupted. There was a rustling of leaves, and the black wolf emerged from the boscage in front of him, whining as if to attract his attention. The beast had somehow lost his appearance of fierceness. Curious and a little alarmed, Anselme watched in wonder while the wolf began to uproot with his paws certain plants that somewhat resembled wild garlic. These he devoured with palpable eagerness. Anselme's mouth gaped at the thing which ensued. One moment the wolf was before him. Then where the wolf had been, there rose up the figure of a man, lean, powerful, with blue-black hair and beard and darkly flaming eyes. The hair grew almost to his brows, the beard nearly to his lower eyelashes. His arms, legs, shoulders, and chest were matted with bristles. "Be assured that I mean you no harm," said the man. "I am Malachy du Marais, a sorcerer, and the one-time lover of Sephora. Tiring of me and fearing my wizardry, she turned me into a werewolf by giving me secretly the waters of a certain pool that lies amid this enchanted domain of Sylaire. The pool is cursed from old time with the infection of lycanthropy, and Sephora has added her spells to its power. I can throw off the wolf shape for a little while during the dark of the moon. At other times, I can regain my human form, though only for a few minutes, by eating the root that you saw me dig and devour. The root is very scarce." Anselme felt that the sorceries of Sylaire were more complicated than he had hitherto imagined, but amid his bewilderment, he was unable to trust the weird being before him. He had heard many tales of werewolves, who were reputedly common in medieval France. Their ferocity, people said, was that of demons rather than of mere brutes. "Allow me to warn you of the grave danger in which you stand," continued Malachy du Marais. "You were rash to let yourself be enticed by Sephora. If you are wise, you will leave the purlieus of Sylaire with all possible dispatch. The land is old in evil and sorcery, and all who dwell within it are ancient as the land, and are equally accursed. The servants of Sephora, who waited upon you yestereve, are vampires that sleep by day in the tower vaults and come forth by night. They go out through the druid portal to prey on the people of Averoigne." He paused as if to emphasize the words that followed. His eyes glittered balefully, and his deep voice assumed a hissing undertone. "Sephora herself is an ancient lamia, well-nigh immortal, who feeds on the vital forces of young men. She has had many lovers throughout the ages, and I must deplore, even though I cannot specify, their ultimate fate. The youth and beauty that she retains are illusions. If you could see Sephora as she really is, you would recoil in revulsion. Cured of your perilous love, you would see her, unthinkably old and hideous with infamies." "But how can such things be?" queried Anselme. "Truly, I cannot believe you." Malachy shrugged his hairy shoulders. "At least I have warned you, but the wolf change approaches, and I must go. If you will come to me later in my abode, which lies a mile to the westward of Sephora's tower, perhaps I can convince you that my statements are the truth." In the meanwhile, ask yourself if you have seen any mirrors, such as a beautiful young woman would use in Sephora's chamber. Vampires and Lamias are afraid of mirrors, for a good reason. Anselme went back to the tower with a troubled mind. What Malachy had told him was incredible. Yet there was the matter of Sephora's servants. He had hardly noticed their absence that morning, and yet he had not seen them since the previous eve, and he could not remember any mirrors among Sephora's various feminine belongings. He found Sephora awaiting him in the tower's lower hall. One glance at the utter sweetness of her womanhood, and he felt ashamed of the doubts with which Mayachi had inspired him. Sephora's blue-gray eyes questioned him, deep and tender as those of some pagan goddess of love. Reserving no detail, he told her of his meeting with the werewolf. "Ah, I did well to trust my intuitions," she said. "Last night, when the black wolf growled and glowered at you, it occurred to me that he was perhaps becoming more dangerous than I had realized. This morning, in my chamber of magic, I made use of my clairvoyant powers and I learned much. Indeed, I have been careless. Malachy has become a menace to my security. Also, he hates you and would destroy our happiness." "Is it true then," questioned Anselme, "that he was your lover and that you turned him into a werewolf?" "He was my lover, long ago, but the werewolf form was his own choice, assumed out of evil curiosity by drinking from the pool of which he told you. He has regretted it since, for the wolf shape, while giving him certain powers of harm, in reality, limits his actions and his sorceries. He wishes to return to human shape, and if he succeeds, will become doubly dangerous to us both. I should have watched him well, for I now find that he has stolen from me the recipe of antidote to the werewolf waters. My clairvoyance tells me that he has already brewed the antidote in the brief intervals of humanity regained by chewing a certain root. When he drinks the potion, as I think that he means to do before long, he will regain human form permanently. He waits only for the dark of the moon, when the werewolf spell is at its weakest." "But why should Malachy hate me?" asked Anselme. "And how can I help you against him?" "That first question is slightly stupid, my dear. Of course, he is jealous of you. As for helping me, well, I thought of a good trick to play on Malachy." She produced a small purple glass vial, triangular in shape, from the folds of her bodice. "This vial," she told him, "is filled with the water of the werewolf pool. Through my clairvoyant vision, I learned that Malachy keeps his newly brewed potion in a vial of similar size, shape, and color. If you can go to his den and substitute one vial for the other without detection, I believe that the results will be quite amusing." "Indeed, I will go," Anselme assured her. "The present should be a favorable time," said Sephora. "It is now within an hour of noon, and Malachy often hunts at this time. If you should find him in his den, or he should return while you are there, you can say that you came in response to his invitation." She gave Anselme careful instructions that would enable to find the werewolf's den without delay. Also, she gave him a sword, saying that the blade had been tempered to the chanting of magic spells that made it effective against such beings as Malachy. "The wolf's temper has grown uncertain," she warned. "If he should attack you, your alder stick would prove a poor weapon." It was easy to locate the den, for well-used paths ran toward it with little deviation. The place was the mounded remnant of a tower that had crumbled down into grassy earth and mossy blocks. The entrance had once been a lofty doorway. Now it was only a hole, such as a large animal would make in leaving and returning to its burrow. Anselme hesitated before the hole. "Are you there, Malachy du Marais?" he shouted. There was no answer, no sound of movement from within. Anselme shouted once more. At last, stooping on hands and knees, he entered the den. Light poured through several apertures, latticed with wandering tree roots, where the mound had fallen in from above. The place was a cavern rather than a room. It stank with carrion remnants, into whose nature Anselme did not inquire too closely. The ground was littered with bones, broken stems, and leaves of plants, and shattered or rusted vessels of alchemic use. A verdigris-eaten kettle hung from a tripod above ashes and ends of charred faggots. Rain-sodden grimoires lay moldering in rusty metal covers. The three-legged ruin of a table was propped against the wall. It was covered with a medley of oddments, among which Anselme discerned a purple vial resembling the one given him by Sephora. In one corner was a litter of dead grass. The strong, rank odor of a wild beast mingled with the carrion stench. Anselme looked about and listened cautiously. Then, without delay, he substituted Sephora's vial for the one on Malachi's table. The stolen vial he placed under his jerkin. There was a padding of feet at the cavern's entrance. Anselme turned to confront the black wolf. The beast came toward him, crouching tensely as if about to spring, with eyes glaring like crimson coals of Avernus. Anselme's fingers dropped to the hilt of the enchanted sword that Sephora had given him. The wolf's eyes followed his fingers. It seemed that he recognized the sword. He turned from Anselme and began to chew some roots of the garlic-like plant, which he had doubtless collected to make possible those operations which he could hardly have carried on in wolfish form. This time, the transformation was not complete. The head and body of Malachi du Marais rose up again before Anselme, but the legs were the hind legs of a monstrous wolf. He was like some bestial hybrid of antique legend. "Your visit honors me," he said, half snarling, with suspicion in his eyes and voice. "Few have cared to enter my poor abode, and I am grateful to you. In recognition of your kindness, I shall make you a present." With the padding movements of a wolf, he went over to the ruinous table and groped amid the confused oddments with which it was covered. He drew out an oblong silver mirror, brightly burnished, with jeweled handle, such as a great lady or damsel might own. This he offered to Anselme. "I give you the mirror of reality," he announced. "In it, all things are reflected according to their true nature. The illusions of enchantment cannot deceive it. You disbelieved me when I warned you against Sephora. But if you hold this mirror to her face and observe the reflection, you will see that her beauty, like everything else in Sylaire, is a hollow lie, the mask of ancient horror and corruption. If you doubt me, hold the mirror to my face. Now, for I too am part of the land's immemorial evil." Anselme took the silver oblong and obeyed Malachi's injunction. A moment, and his nerveless fingers almost dropped the mirror. He had seen reflected within it a face that the sepulchre should have hidden long ago. The horror of that sight had shaken him so deeply that he could not afterwards recall the circumstances of his departure from the werewolf's lair. He had kept the werewolf's gift, but more than once he had been prompted to throw it away. He tried to tell himself that what he had seen was merely the result of some wizard trick. He refused to believe that any mirror would reveal Sephora as anything but the young and lovely sweetheart whose kisses were still warm on his lips. All such matters, however, were driven from Anselme's mind by the situation that he found when he re-entered the tower hall. 3 visitors had arrived during his absence. They stood fronting Sephora, who, with a tranquil smile on her lips, was apparently trying to explain something to them. Anselme recognized the visitors with much amusement, not untouched with consternation. One of them was Dorothée de Flèche, clad in a trim traveling habit. The others were 2 serving men of her father, armed with longbows, quivers of arrows, broadswords, and daggers. In spite of this array of weapons, they did not look any too comfortable or at home. But Dorothée seemed to have retained her usual matter-of-fact assurance. "What are you doing in this queer place, Anselme?" she cried. "And who is this woman, this châtelaine of Sylaire, as she calls herself?" Anselme felt that she would hardly understand any answer that he could give to either query. He looked at Sephora, then back at Dorothée. Sephora was the essence of all the beauty and romance that he had ever craved. How could he have fancied himself in love with Dorothée? How could he have spent 13 months in a hermitage because of her coldness and changeability? She was pretty enough, with the common bodily charms of youth, but she was stupid, wanting in imagination, prosy already in the flush of her girlhood as a middle-aged housewife. Small wonder that she had failed to understand him. "What brings you here?" he countered. "I had not thought to see you again." "I missed you, Anselme," she sighed. "People said that you had left the world because of your love for me and had become a hermit. At last I came to seek you, but you had disappeared. Some hunters had seen you pass yesterday with a strange woman across the moor of druid stones. They said you had both vanished beyond the cromlech, fading as if in air. Today I followed you with my father's serving men. We found ourselves in this strange region, of which no one has ever heard. And now this woman, The sentence was interrupted by a mad howling that filled the room with eldritch echoes. The black wolf, with jaws foaming and slavering, broke in through the door that had been opened to admit Sephora's visitors. Dorothée de Flesh began to scream as he dashed straight toward her, seeming to single her out for the first victim of his rabid fury. Something, it was plain, had maddened him. Perhaps the water of the werewolf pool, substituted for the antidote, had served to redouble the original curse of lycanthropy. The two serving men, bristling with their arsenal of weapons, stood like effigies. Anselme drew the sword given him by the enchantress and leaped forward between Dorothée and the wolf. He raised his weapon, which was straight-bladed and suitable for stabbing. The mad werewolf sprang as if hurled from a catapult, and his red open gorge was spitted on the outthrust point. Anselme's hand was jarred on the sword hilt, and the shock drove him backward. The wolf fell thrashing at Anselme's feet. His jaws had clenched on the blade. The point protruded beyond the stiff bristles of his neck. Anselme tugged vainly at the sword. Then the black-furred body ceased to thrash, and the blade came easily. It had been withdrawn from the sagging mouth of the dead ancient sorcerer, Malachy du Marais, which lay before Anselme on the flagstones. The sorcerer's face was now the face that Anselme had seen in the mirror when he held it up at Malachy's injunction. "You have saved me! How wonderful!" cried Dorothée. Anselme saw that she had started toward him with outthrust arms. A moment more, and the situation would become embarrassing. He recalled the mirror, which he had kept under his jerkin, together with the vial stolen from Malachy du Marais. What, he wondered, would Dorothée see in its burnished depths? He drew the mirror forth swiftly and held it to her face as she advanced upon him. What she beheld in the mirror he never knew, but the effect was startling. Dorothée gasped, and her eyes dilated in manifest horror. Then, covering her eyes with her hands, as if to shut out some ghastly vision, she ran shrieking from the hall. The serving men followed her. The celerity of their movements made it plain that they were not sorry to leave this dubious lair of wizards and witches. Sephora began to laugh softly. Anselme found himself chuckling. For a while they abandoned themselves to uproarious mirth, then Sephora sobered. "I know why Malachy gave you the mirror," she said. "Do you not wish to see my reflection in it?" Anselme realized that he still held the mirror in his hand. Without answering Sephora, he went over to the nearest window, which looked down on a deep pit lined with bushes that had been part of an ancient, half-filled moat. He hurled the silver oblong into the pit. "I am content with what my eyes tell me, without the aid of any mirror," he declared. "Now let us pass to other matters which have been interrupted too long." Again, the clinging deliciousness of Sephora was in his arms, and her fruit-soft mouth was crushed beneath his hungry lips. The strongest of all enchantments held them in its golden circle. The end.